Welcome, everyone, to the Inside Story podcast, where we take you behind the scenes of building diverse businesses and becoming a successful entrepreneur. I'm your host, Dursun Halimova, a business coach and facilitator on a mission to help build impactful businesses. And today, my guest is Isabelle Mattern, who is a visual and communication designer and owner of studio with the same name, Isabelle Mattern, here in Luxembourg. Through her studio, Isabelle engages in drawing, writing, graphic design, typography, branding, workshops, and much more. Isabelle, it's great to have you on the Inside Story podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
To start off, it's a tradition on my podcast. I will read several unfinished sentences and I would ask you to finish them for us, please. The first one. Being an entrepreneur means
being curious and innovative.
Building an impactful business requires
Resilience and not being afraid to fail.
Failure is
Playfulness.
Success is a result of
Authenticity.
Being fulfilled in life means
Being able to be myself, I would say.
Thank you so much for those, Isabelle. Tell us a little bit about you and as well as your studio. What do you do and who do you work with?
So as you said, I'm a communication designer. So I work in different communication tools, different materials, in a lot of print and anything that is connected in some way to communication. So it can be graphic design, can be illustration, drawing, branding, as you said, identity, but it's also helping people to communicate something and also figuring out what the thing is that they want to communicate and to who. But it's through books, through workshops, getting people involved in figuring out for themselves what communication is, communicating and connecting with other people, connecting with themselves.
And who do you work with generally? Individuals or companies?
I work with a lot of institutions and museums. For a lot of them lately is with workshops and different printing techniques, with biodiversity, with a Riso printer. And on the other side, I also work with new entrepreneurs. I work with artists working on communicating their work, their portfolio, creating their communication tools that they then use to promote their work, whether it's fine artists or cultural mediation, book design, posters, drawings, printing materials.
Wow, that's a lot of different clientele. And help us understand maybe on the illustration of me, for example. I'm a business coach. If I were to work with you, how would you help me?
So first of all, it's figuring out what it is that you want to communicate and why you want to communicate that to who. It's not necessarily saying like, okay, you need business cards or you need a poster, but it's figuring out what the message is and what is the best way to communicate that. It might be business cards, it might be an image, a video, stickers, flyers. It's not limited to one area. It's more like adapted to the project itself.
I often hear this brand identity, right? A lot of business owners, but also I think professionals think around creating their personal brand. But I think in particular, it's very relevant for businesses. So in terms of creating a brand, a business brand, do I understand correctly, then this might involve a logo, maybe colors that, for example, in my case, right? So for this specific podcast, it took me a while to figure out the colors I wanted. They're not great, but I chose them because of the meaning that they represent. In my example, I guess then kind of help would be, maybe designing a better logo and choosing better shades of green and yellow, right? And maybe better typography. Am I right?
First of all, for me, it's very important to have a concept. So it's not just a particular color that I like or that the person likes, but there is a meaning. So you're already on a good way. And so it's being intentional with the message and knowing what that message is and who you're speaking to. And I like to think of it more as like a visual identity or an atmosphere. So you're inviting other people into your environment in a way, in your world, having the right tools, or whether that's the colors, as you said, or logo, or typefaces, illustrations, different visual systems that allow your work to be recognizable and distinguished from other work. And also for you to be able to use that and integrate that by yourself as well.
Indeed. I think that's one of the cornerstones of building a recognizable brand. I think for a lot of us, solopreneurs, startups, small business owners, would be great to have a brand that is easily recognizable, similar to Apple logo or Nike, right? Whenever you see, you know what company it represents and even what values they represent. So yeah, I think it's so important to understand, decide for yourself as a business owner, what am I trying to communicate and what is the best way then to communicate that message.
It's
Amazing.
also important to remember that the logos didn't just start, like there's a long process behind them. So there's the logos, but then there's also a lot of storytelling, and they've been there for quite some time. So of course that also adds to the recognizability. So it's, yeah, I think a long process that hasn't happened for the brands overnight, but that got reinforced over and over again. And through that, through the storytelling, to marketing, to all the things, it's not just a logo. Of course, the logos are strong and recognizable, but they don't necessarily function on their own. So they're part of a system.
Indeed, yeah. I think, yeah, to your point, storytelling kind of helping people understand, right? I think storytelling makes it so much easier, and having the visual components then to tell that story, it makes it much more powerful.
Makes it also easier for yourself, actually, because you kind of have your own guidelines. Because sometimes you're just like doing your thing, and it is helpful, at least I think, for me to know, okay, these are the values, the intentions, where I'm headed, what I want to work on, instead of going like all kinds of directions that it could go. It kind of helps you be more intentional with what you're working on.
Yeah, and it's so important when you are a business owner to have that clarity and focus. Thank you for sharing these, and maybe take us to the beginning. From what I know, you started your studio right before COVID, which I'm assuming was a great challenge and uncertainty to deal with as a new business owner, especially. What were some of the other challenges that you experienced while setting up your business?
So yeah, we talked about that in previously, that I launched a month before the pandemic came to Luxembourg. And I had actually taken quite a bit of time out before that to get ready, to know what I was going to work on, focus on, set up my business plan, business model canvas with different workshops and tutoring with Newco and other institutions. So I felt kind of ready to launch. And the few projects that I had scheduled were, whether it was workshops, it was museum work or events, were the main projects that I had planned to start, that we were starting to work on. And they were all put on hold, or either they would be transferred to the next year or cancelled. And of course, there was no new work coming in because everyone was kind of holding their breath. And by that time, I had actually already joined the co-working, which was nice. So I had a few connections with people that were also sort of in the beginning or mid-launch or entrepreneurs for a few years. So already not going through that by myself was helpful, but it was of course scary because the few things that I had planned, I wasn't sure what was going to happen next and where to get new projects, make new connections, because I was aware even then that networking and connecting with people was an important part of creating my studio or my practice, and evolving that. Because from the beginning, I didn't want it to stay in one way, but I was wanting it to evolve, and I'm not able to do that by myself. So it was scary. And then, just because I had already the awareness that it was going to be slower the first few years as well. So in a way, I was sort of prepared for slowness, maybe not as as much slowness or halting as it ended up being. It's straight from the beginning. It helped me reinvestigate or re-question the things or the work, the projects that I was planning on doing and how I was going to work. So it made me even more critical of my approach in working.
Yeah, it is extremely challenging, especially during the COVID. There was so much uncertainty in the air. Nobody could tell how long this is going to go on. And yeah, to your point, I think a lot of organizations, companies like really didn't make a lot of spending decisions because it was just so much lack of clarity at that point. And from what I know, I've seen some of your work through your social media channels, through your website. You are a talented visual communication designer. But obviously, setting up a studio, unfortunately, doesn't only require the specific expertise, but also business know-how. How did you go about becoming a business person and developing the business skills and expertise necessary to set up and run your studio?
A lot of it is learning by doing, as hard as it might be, because we learn design skills, conceptual things, execution, crafts, but not so much marketing. We had a bit of marketing, but mostly was focused on learning what we were there to learn, not becoming entrepreneurs during university. So it was mostly figuring out things as I went along. So I joined, as I said earlier, I joined a few workshops by Newco, by House Entrepreneurship. The year before, I joined online courses, online classes, and talking to people and basically making mistakes and correcting them. And as I go on, it just becomes quicker because I know ways that work for me or that have worked in the past or what hasn't worked. It's a lot of trial and error. I'm sure a lot of people say, well, maybe other people go into it with actual economics education. It's something that I've been interested in on my side before. So yeah, with curiosity and humbleness. Yeah.
I think it's so important, to your point, to try things. We never know. I mean, there are, I think, areas of our lives we decide to do things, learn new things that where we are kind of a beginner, right? So I think for a lot of people, especially those who don't have business expertise, but they have other skills or expertise in specific area, when they become business owners, then you have to learn things on the go. And I think that's the best way to learn, kind of trial, error. To your point, as you were mentioning in the beginning, being playful, right? This is one thing that I try to look at building and running a business. It's just like a game. Play it, see how you can find new ways, experiment, and there's no failure per se, as long as this failure helps you learn something and leads you to a better path, hopefully. So I couldn't agree more with that kind of trial and error.
It can be very intimidating looking from the outside. But yeah, I think playfulness and not taking it too seriously can be hard, but it's also important to find that balance because obviously you also in some way need to survive and need money to live. So it's nice to think of the image of the artist that doesn't need anything, but we have bills to pay. We need food to eat, we need place.
Indeed. And tell us then, how did you go about building a visibility around you and your services? And maybe even tell us, how did you get your first client?
As a designer in general, it's always important to have a portfolio, which is something that I've always had during university, from university onwards. And I think the internet is very helpful in that, to get that visibility and reach to people that you don't know, whether they are local or internationally. So that's definitely a plus. Of course, nowadays there's a lot more saturation on the internet, but definitely the portfolio showing the work that you do, the processes, some behind the scenes, not too much, because otherwise it's easy to just get wrapped up in all the communication and not actually doing the work. And then, of course, a network, talking to people, meeting new people, asking questions. I think network especially is very important, which is something that I also wanted to mention earlier in if you don't know something, you can ask someone else what they went through, whether they're specialists in the areas or whether they went through it before, being self-made specialists themselves. And so my first client came, it is difficult to pinpoint which is the first client because there's always been some kind of work. So where does the first client start? But in relation to the practice that I'm doing right now, or as a studio, that was a connection that I made through someone else I met before the pandemic at the networking for a co-working space. So it was not very specific. It was someone that aligned with their values. So going and meeting people or reaching out to people is very important in that sense, especially with the work that I'm doing, which is very local when it's the workshops, especially. Of course, when it's online, then it's not necessarily meeting people in person, but there's always the sense of visibility of putting yourself out there, which can also be very intimidating. Yeah, just asking a lot of questions, connecting with people.
Indeed, that's so important. I think that's in a way, that is an easier way and effective way to do sales too, asking questions. That's what I usually tell my clients who I work with. Like, a lot of business owners are afraid, they hate even doing sales. But then, my response is, be curious. You don't have to sell. Just be curious. Like, what are people looking for? What are their problems, challenges, aspirations? If you ask enough questions from place of curiosity and caring, I think then it becomes easy then to do the sale, because you either understand that you are not a match, you shouldn't even go into selling conversation, or you get the reinforcement and confirmation that indeed this is the right client and what I have to offer is a right fit. I totally agree with that, asking questions and meeting people.
I think it's also important to not go to events or networking with them in mind, being like, I need to make connections, I need to find clients. It's more about meeting people, and then you find projects that you want to collaborate on, and to the work that you do, which is authentic to you and which is in line with the work that you do. You get other visibilities, you reach other people that align again with the work that you're doing, instead of being like, okay, I need to talk to this amount of people, and these are the outcomes, which of course works for some people. That's not how I'm working right now. Yeah, which means that it's a lot less controllable, but I also am more aligned with that way of evolving my work. It might not be as efficient or slower, but yeah.
Whatever works for you, right? I think it's important to find an approach that works for you and aligns with your values. And Isabelle, now looking back, you started over 4 years ago. Now looking back, what are some of the things that you decided to drop or stop doing because they were not working? And what are the things that really worked that you continue doing in terms of running and growing your business?
Especially when I was starting out the first year or 2 years, because it was so slowed down with the pandemic, I was learning a lot about systems, about setup, invoicing, administration, which took a lot more time, which I only could learn by doing, making mistakes, working on my own communication skills and social soft skills. What I would maybe have done differently, I don't know if I had that capacity back then, to actually be more intentional, being like, okay, well, I was doing a lot of different things. As I said, you can't do all the things, and to be more intentional about like what specific amount of time I'm focusing on my work, this specialization, this method, which I'm doing more now, but also which came to, I was doing more work that was more in that specialization. So it kind of came hand in hand. I was doing a lot of different things, and to repeatedly doing similar projects, I was able to narrow them down into one area, which, yeah, so I could not have done them differently, but it is always easier to narrow it down and then open up, because it allows you to have more focus and clarity and not as many things going on in the mind. But at the same time, that's also how my mind works. So it is a lot, again, learning by doing.
Yeah, the same thing for me. I need to try different things to find something that works, that sticks, that I like, I kind of feel comfortable. And there is a lot of advantage to, from the get-go, to know this is exactly what I'm going to do, kind of very narrow, very focused. And then if you want, with time, expand and grow. But it's often very difficult to do, right? When you are just starting, you feel like, like there's so many things you could be doing, and you are excited, enthusiastic, and you want to try them all. I think depending on personalities, like people can use different ways, like whatever works. Of course, I think your and my approach is a bit more time and energy consuming, but hopefully we end up finding only a few things that we really love.
It's also important to remember it's not just one thing for the rest of your life, because there's different seasons, there's different phases. So just because you're not focusing on one thing right now, it doesn't mean you're never going to work on it.
Indeed. Yeah.
Because in the beginning was like, I want to do all these things, because if I don't do them now, I will never do them, which isn't really true.
But let me follow up on this, because we were talking in our earlier conversation, right, how to prioritize, because there are so many things we could be doing at any given time, but we have limited resources, time, capacity, finances, right? How do you prioritize what activities to implement versus what to postpone or what to let go?
It's a tricky one because, I mean, of course, the things prioritizing is client work, things that need to be done. And then also I often need to remind myself to also work on my own projects, because those projects are workshops, things that I experiment on afterwards also feed the work that I do with different clients, or also bring new projects, help me like through learning these new techniques or exploring different self-initiated work. I get to create work that is more in line with what I want to create, or I learn what I don't want to do. So prioritizing, of course, there's the practical income, your fees, but then also remembering that it's not just business, it's also a life, and you need to, even enjoying what you do, you also need to find a counterpart where you're allowing yourself to create and not being in a forcing state of creation because you need to work. Yeah. I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you did. And maybe as a, I'm curious because this creativity thing is such a difficult thing, right? I truly believe each person is creative in their own way, maybe not in this kind of traditional artistic way, but and creativity is something that is very difficult to force. I've heard people say, like artists say, the moment someone started paying for my work, I lost my interest into actually doing my craft, right? And to your point, right, then you have to, as a business owner, you have to find clients, meet their needs. And I'm assuming you work with deadlines, right? And what you do is very creative work. So how do you manage to not to let this time pressure, the external pressure, the client deadlines and so on, disturb your creativity?
And that's not going to sell well. It's a slow process. It doesn't sell well.
No, it doesn't. Yeah. So that's the trick, right? Like, I mean, I want to produce things. Like I generally maybe write content for a YouTube video or a social media post. And it's just like, it takes me hours. And I want to just sit and, like in 5 minutes, I want to be done. But you can't force these things, right? So how do you make yourself be creative? And how do you balance then allowing yourself the space and time to be creative versus having that external pressure?
It's a practice. It's not one stop and done, but it's something, and I've heard a lot of artists, designers, or creative people do that. It's a lot about routine and showing up, even if you don't feel like it, even if you think, oh, I'm not in the right mindset to create. It's creating that space and that openness for things to come up. And sometimes they come up very quickly, and other times it just won't click until, I don't know, you're walking outside in the forest and you're like, oh, this is it. So it's a lot of trusting, which might sound a bit spiritual.
Trusting the process.
Yeah.
I think I wouldn't be wrong to say a lot of people, if not most people, want to be an overnight success. But when we look at most, if not all, successful entrepreneurs, they are but overnight success, right? There are maybe years of learning, iteration, experimentation, and so on. You mentioned that when you started your business, you had the mindset that it will take 1 to 3 years for you to set up your business and be financially sustainable. How did you keep up the work? Show up every day, day after day, even when you didn't see any immediate results?
Especially in the beginning, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm that kind of helps with that, because you're just starting. It's all very fresh, it's exciting. Also excitement about the fact that you get to decide what you want to work on. You get to choose the work you want to work on. Of course, there's things you want to do more or less. You can't just do all the things that you want to do. There's always unpleasant parts, but to allowing myself to show up in a way that I want to show up right now, and excitement about the work that I'm doing, the projects that I work on, which are meaningful to me. I think that kind of keeps the excitement up. But then there's also days where I don't show up. It happens.
Which is okay.
Yeah.
Which is okay.
And then learning that it is okay to not being 1,000% productive every day. especially in the creative fields where it's not on you push a button and it's an outcome. That's not how it works. To actually getting to decide or allowing things to come up and creation to happen when it happens in some way. It's not very practical. That is also one of the reasons why I work for myself, because that's regularity or that pressure of expecting an outcome during specific times of the day or at specific moments. I think that especially helps, that excitement and the gratitude of you get to decide what you want to work on and how you want to create things, and knowing that that's meaningful to a certain extent to certain people.
It's so important to find something that you love and you're passionate about. It becomes easier to then persevere through difficult moments, even if when you don't see the immediate results. At least if you love what you do, it's easier. It's easier to show up.
It's also that you get to choose. No one is forcing you to do that. So
Indeed.
it's also necessary to remember that.
I think it's so important. I try to always remind myself there are days when I have a lot of things to do and I just catch myself saying, "Oh, I have to do this, I have to do that." And then I pause and I'm like, I get to do this because it's my choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, having your own business, being your own boss, while it has a lot of downsides, I think one of the things is that you decide what you do, what projects you work on, and which clients you work with. So there's one other question that I want to ask before we end, and that question was left by my previous guest. They left this question without knowing who they're leaving it for. And you kind of touched upon this question already. The question reads, what is one thing you wish you had done differently in starting your business?
I did what I could back then, and there's always things I could have done more of, like sharing my work more. I did that especially in the beginning because, of course, that was visibility to be established and more sharing of new work, more learning new skills and creating more self-directed projects, which I did to some extent. But of course, there's always more things I could have done. But in general, I did what I could.
I think that's the greatest feeling to have, that you have done what you could. And I think the saddest thing I see is sometimes in people, entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, like they have a big ambition, big dreams, but they don't take chance on themselves. So showing up, doing the best you can is already is great. And looking back, at least you won't have any regrets, right? So you've done what you could. And also sometimes things don't always depend on you. There are external factors that also influence, like in your case, starting your business during COVID, that must have been like really difficult. Thank you, Isabelle, so much for taking the time to come on the Inside Story podcast to share your entrepreneurial journey. Through your experience, you have demonstrated the importance of playfulness, experimentation, taking time, and trusting the process. Sometimes, or maybe more often than not, slow may be better than going fast. So thank you for the wisdom you have shared today with our listeners.
Thank you.